Thank you for joining Jennifer Shelton Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday. You can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and our recordings are also on our website and our YouTube channel. One of over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website. Please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can feel free to reach out to us and we'll get back to you on that. All right, our speaker today is Kevin Pomfret, who's going to be covering a framework for due diligence of data and M&A transaction. Thank you for joining us today, Kevin. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Mallory. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. For those of you who joined, who were at the earlier talk at 12 o'clock, this will go into more details around the framework for due diligence and a transaction around data. And by that I mean the transaction isn't necessarily around data, but there's an M&A transaction and there's data that's being involved in the target company, how you go about looking at what the risks and what the value of that is. So if you could do the next slide, please, Mallory. So as I mentioned at 12 o'clock, I believe that data is an asset in more and more organizations, and so therefore, as a lawyer, I look at ways to make sure that the organization can protect its value and minimize the operational and legal risk. And when you think of it in that way, and you're doing a corporate transaction, an M&A, or an investment, you want to make sure that you do sufficient due diligence around the data assets to make sure that you understand what you're acquiring, that the value is there, even if it doesn't show up on the financial statements, at least that the value that you expect that you're going to get from an operational standpoint is there, and that you can minimize the risks. And so that's why I've developed this framework for due diligence of data in a corporate transaction. Next slide, please, Mallory. So today I'm going to be talking about 5 separate areas. Please go back one. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about 5 separate areas that I think are important to think about from as a framework standpoint. One are the operational considerations, how the target company uses the data. Second is ownership rights, who has ownership or intellectual property rights or any other rights associated with the data in the target company. What are their internal policies and procedures associated with that data and how they use it? What obligations and rights do they have in contracts, licenses, agreements, whether those be customer contracts, whether those be website terms of service, whether those be customer agreements, all the different ways that they're ingesting data into their organization, either directly or indirectly, and then developing products and services, what obligations or rights are associated with that, and then looking a little bit at insurance as a way to help protect against any risk and understand what's covered and what's not covered in the target company. Next slide, please, Mallory. So I'm going to sort of walk through a number of questions that I think about when doing due diligence around data. And then this first set will be around operational considerations. So what data does the target company obtain from third parties, and how do they obtain it? So that might be directly from consumers through a website or by providing a product and service. It may be from third parties that they license data from. It may be part of a software service that they provide, and then they get certain data as part of that as well, as is increasingly happen within companies. So just understanding how the company is obtaining data is going to be important. And this isn't just personal information, it's any type of data that may be subject to being used by the target company. The next piece of that is, how does the company use and store the data? that's going to be an important consideration as well. For those of you who are familiar with data protection and privacy laws, mapping the data is very important for an organization. Understanding where it resides, what countries, what servers, who has access to it, from a privacy standpoint is important, but it's also important from a larger standpoint. Understanding what a target company has, where it is, who has access to it, are they adequately trained for the particular use, particularly if it's being used in products and services, is going to be important. And are they familiar with and are they following the laws and policies, particularly with regard to personal information, whether that be the GDPR, whether that be data breach laws, whether that be the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is going to be coming in, implemented in January of this year. Any of those laws, are they aware of them? Are they taking steps to protect against that? And that's going to be increasingly important, particularly around personal information, but also around other types of information that are being used to develop products and services or used internally for decision making. Next slide, please, Mallory. Similarly to the data protection is what sort of cybersecurity measures has the target company implemented? Are those adequate? Do those satisfy certain regulatory concerns? For instance, if they're the financial industry or the health industry, those are important considerations as well. If they're a government contractor, are they aware of the new requirements that the government's imposing, particularly if they're in the Department of Defense, and are they up to speed on those? All of those considerations need to be looked at. Understanding whether the target company has been sued or threatened with a lawsuit or subject to an investigation from a regulatory standpoint, or whether they've had to do an analysis because they had a concern that there had been a data breach and they didn't know if they needed to satisfy certain state data breach requirements. All are measures that an organization will want to take, and has been shown in the past couple of years, failing to do that has resulted in significant operational and penalties for companies who've acquired a liability associated with a data breach or a breach of personal information. So this is particularly important. And is the data being used in decision making, is it fit for purpose for the application it's being used? As I mentioned on the earlier call, there are different types of data quality standards that should be considered. Is it accurate enough? Is it precise enough? Is it timely enough? Is it complete enough? Does the organization have quality assurance and quality control processes in place to make sure that those decisions are being made with data that is of sufficient quality? And those are going to be increasingly important, particularly as we start moving into AI and machine learning, and decision making is being made more and more in a black box, if you will, based on algorithms, and understanding where the data is coming from is going to be very important. Next slide, please, Mallory. So the next set of issues around, as I said, ownership rights, understanding does the company create data products and services that are shared externally? And if so, are they providing adequate protection in their agreements or from a technical standpoint to make sure that the value associated with that data is being protected? And similarly, if the target company is using data from third parties, is it complying with the requirements that those third parties have from an intellectual property standpoint, from a contractual standpoint, and as products and services are being used around or being developed using a variety of sources, both internal and external, making sure that the derivative products that may be created are subject to or complying with the applicable licenses or agreements, and also that they're protected going forward. So those are going to be increasingly important issues in a due diligence inquiry as well. Next slide, please. I have a specific section on open data, a specific question around open data, and this isn't applicable to a lot of companies, but many companies, particularly in the government space, are using open data as part of their products and services. And understanding what the licensing terms associated with that are, if they're for instance, if they're subject to share alike provisions, much like in the open software licenses, understanding that is going to be increasingly important. There's a tendency within the open data community that thinks data can and should be shared freely, but they're all subject to license agreements, and in my experience, some organizations are less aware of the risks associated with or the terms associated with those. And if you're an acquiring company, you don't want to take on that risk, or at least you want to understand what that risk may be. As I mentioned, the derivative products, you want to understand what the respective rights of all the different parties that have contributed to that derivative products are, making sure that there's no risk of someone coming back and saying that they have certain rights in that derivative product. And I mentioned scraping data. For some organizations, there is a policy to go out and collect data off the websites of third parties and integrate that into their decision-making or into their data holdings. And the law around that is still somewhat unclear and can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So just understanding what those are, what those laws are, and how the data was collected, and what rights that data was subject to, what type of data it is, are all part of the process that I think organizations need to consider when they're doing due diligence to make sure that the target company has complied with, or has taken the steps necessary to make sure they're in compliance with the law. Next slide, please, Mallory. So as any type of due diligence process, understanding internal policies and procedures is important. Certainly from a data protection standpoint, that's the case. Understanding what privacy policies they have in place, whether those privacy policies, whether they're internal policies that can make sure that those privacy policies, that external privacy policies, are being complied with. Is there sufficient cybersecurity response? If there's been a breach, who's responsible? Is there a point of contact? Has there been sufficient training for individuals, both around cybersecurity and data protection? Is there a data breach response plan? If so, has it been complied with if there was a data breach? Is there a business continuity plan? Are those plans adequate for the situation from a business standpoint, and in some cases for insurance coverage as well? So all of those things are issues that need to be addressed and understood in a due diligence process. And then quality assurance, quality control policies and procedures. Do they understand the risks or potential risks associated with the data that they're using for products and services, whether they be external or internal? And if so, is there someone making sure that it's accurate enough, timely enough, complete enough, and not being used for other purposes? Because sometimes once data gets into an organization and someone sees its value, it can be used for another purpose, because data often seems that it can be, but just because it can be used for another purpose doesn't mean it's of sufficient quality, unless your target company has some folks who are very familiar with the data science and quality issues. Sometimes data can be used in a way that it's not fit for it, so it's important to be able to balance those and make sure that the organization have policies in place to deal with that. Next slide, please, Mallory. So I put contracts, licenses, agreements. In my mind, the privacy policy that an organization puts on its website, making sure that it's complied with those policies, is very important. For those of you who follow privacy, you'll know that one of the areas where the Federal Trade Commission has gone after companies is when they have to say they're going to do something on their privacy policy on their website, and then they don't actually do it. That's an area where the FTC can go after you, even if it's not technically a violation of privacy law itself. It can be considered a deceptive or unfair trade practice. And so it's important to make sure that the organization can do what it says it's doing on the website and has been doing that, and that you as the acquiring company can do the same thing. And then also, as in any type of asset, making sure that the agreements with vendors and customers both refer to any type of data, including personal information, and you understand the provisions regarding data security, what requirements are being imposed on the target company, and what requirements is the target company imposing on its vendors, both on its vendors and its customers, and are those being complied with? Are there indemnification provisions? Is there insurance to deal with a data breach or a cybersecurity incident of some sort? All of those things are something that should be considered from a third-party standpoint. Next slide, please. And then understanding what representations and covenants has been made to third parties with respect to the quality of the data or the related products and services, and making sure that the acquiring company understands what those risks are, and that it feels comfortable that the acquiring company, the target company, can make those representations. Has there been any claims against those? Do they have any concerns associated with those? Do they have insurance? And we'll talk about insurance a little bit to address those. If there have been products and services that have been sold, that using data, is there adequate insurance for data quality issues? And do the third-party providers, do the customers, the data vendors, do they have adequate protection? Do you have adequate protection from them, or does the target company have adequate protection in the event that the quality of the data that's been ingested into the target company is insufficient for the uses that they're being used? And that's going to be increasingly important, again, as products and services are developing around real-time decision-making and of decision-making of increased value. And we're going to see that as we move into the Internet of Things and machine learning and augmented reality, and understanding that and being able to protect against that is going to be important. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And then the last component, and one that I don't think is necessarily thought of as much as it should be, certainly people are looking at data protection, cybersecurity insurance, and making sure that the target company has those. But being able to understand what the various language is, what the exclusion are, how courts are looking at some of the cases that are developing here recently as insurance companies are pushing back against claims for data protection or cybersecurity breaches. There's a lot of different levels of issues associated with that, and we could do a whole webinar associated with those around insurance. But being able to understand what that is, and whether the coverage is adequate and whether the exclusions are sufficient or overly burdensome are going to be important. And then also, what, if any, insurance coverage does the target company have covering liabilities that arise to poor data quality? And that's insurance that it has on itself, but also insurance that it may have from its vendors. And then also, if there's any insurance obligations that have been put on it by its customers, is sometimes the case as well. So again, this is something that in a lot of other different type of assets or other different type of risks, businesses are very familiar with and work closely on. But in my experience, it's still an emerging area, particularly around due diligence and data issues, and so it needs to be considered. And now I think that's it.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today. If you have any questions for him, you can reach out to him with email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.